After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the basic concepts underlying memory, know the importance of cross-cultural influences on memory, understand the basic concepts underlying learning, and know the importance of cross-cultural influences on learning. With the reading of previous modules, you are now familiar with theoretical positions of cross-cultural psychology and contemporary perspectives on culture and cognition. In this module, we discuss the cultural influence on cognition, especially memory and learning. Generally speaking, cognition means thinking. The American Psychological Association defines it as the processes of knowing, including attending, remembering, and reasoning. Also, the content of the processes such as concepts and memories. The following sections discuss in detail the influence of culture on memory as well as learning. Learning. Landmarks of learning theories in mainstream psychology. Learning is generally understood as the process based on experience that results in a relatively permanent change in behavior or behavior potential. Thus, this general definition used in books of general psychology has been emphasizing that an individual can acquire information that has potentiality to bring change in our actions. Nevertheless, the change is neither temporary nor totally permanent. With this general idea about learning, psychologists in mainstream psychology had made an attempt to develop theoretical positions. These positions take a stand whereby they endeavor to uncover the questions like why, how, what level does learning takes place. Two major landmarks in development of learning theories can be reported as behavioristic approach. Behavioristic approach emphasized that individual acquires and maintains the information through stimulus-response connection or stimulus-stimulus connection. This form of learning stresses that change occurs at behavioral level and can be manifested at the behavioral level itself. The second is the cognitive form of learning. It emphasizes that the change is observed in the mental structure of an individual. Nevertheless, the change in mental structures is demonstrated in the behavior of an individual. Socio-cultural theories consider the relationship between thinking and the social, cultural, historical, and institutional context in which it occurs. The rediscovery of the work has led to the understanding that learning and development are culturally embedded and socially supported or mediated processes. These forms of learning take a reductionist, mechanistic, and deterministic approach to learning. Though environment is given due significance, yet cultural processes and variables are ignored. Relationship between learning and culture. Since mainstream psychology had revealed the significance of environment in the process of learning, nevertheless, they had taken an absolutist position and emphasized that these processes are generalized across cultures. Research indicates that cultural factors are influential in the learning processes. However, there is a need of researchers to draw attention to the factors that exhibit such an impact. Culture has been viewed as a system of shared practices and meanings imbibed by an individual. Along with this, individuals also reconstruct their practices on an interactive basis. Early approaches to the dynamics between culture and learning were tinted with discriminatory social philosophies. For example, a lot of research was done on the culture of poverty. However, as societies changed post-1970s, scholars began to argue against such inequitable theories describing, example, colored children as different instead of deficient. Such work has been further enhanced with people now promoting classroom strategies such as multicultural education. Perhaps the most important work has been done by Lev Vygotsky, who gave the socio-cultural theory. The theory involves various themes. Some major tenets are: development occurs on multiple levels simultaneously. Cultural practices as a unit of analysis for developmental process. Cultural tools and artifacts as influential mediators of psychological process. Learning is constituted by changes in social relations and social world, etc. According to Vygotsky, learning constitutes dynamic relations of context on multiple levels. These relationships affect the overall development of the child. Thus, cultural practices not only mediate but also are used as a unit of analysis for understanding learned behavior of the child. Thus, in our forthcoming section, we will attempt to uncover cultural understanding about learning and the cultural practices in different culture. Epistemological understanding of learning in different cultures. Cultural beliefs about the concept of learning shape an individual's actual learning. Western beliefs of learning and teaching are based on the Socratic ideals, wherein the emphasis lies on creating the best learner by developing and using the mind for probing into the world. They are encouraged to question and reject theories and ideas. In such a scenario, intelligence assumes a key role. This involves theoretical and psychometric traditions of IQ testing, revealing a deep-seated importance given to cognitive and mental functioning with a special emphasis on verbal and logical mathematical skills. This contrasts sharply with the African ideals, which focus on wisdom, trustworthiness, social attentiveness, and responsibility. Also, they have a mind orientation, which elaborates on differentiated mental functions to understand their environment, build up personal skills, and achieve their private goals. Their attitudes towards understanding as a process differ as well. For example, British pupils consider understanding as a sudden insight and use repetition to verify their memory. Eastern cultures differ in this regard. Their orientation is to become a more virtuous person by the process of learning. In the Chinese culture, this follows the Confucian intellectual tradition. Learning implies full knowledge of the precedents of the past ago. This indicates a positive and trusting attitude towards the past and confidence in the past wisdom. Their understanding of the concept of intelligence is different from the West too. The Japanese, for example, give due importance to social competence such as sociability, ability to sympathize with others, etc. Also, they have a value orientation wherein understanding the world alone is not enough. It has a moral overtone regarding the person as a whole. Their attitudes towards understanding process are markedly different from their Western counterparts. For example, Chinese students used hard work, commitment, and diligence more than their British peers. They believe understanding to be a process involving wide-ranging personal efforts, which can be achieved by persistence and repetition. Thus, learning, which is not just an innate tendency, but develops through socialization, is clearly impacted by cultural systems. Individuals' own understanding of learning is inclusive of cognition, affect, and behavioral processes. Cross-cultural practices of learning. Learning is an important and all-encompassing component of our world. It is influenced by a large number of factors, including cultural factors. We will discuss such influences in this section. Since research on this aspect is still an ongoing process, we will cover cultural influences on only certain facets of learning, namely learning approaches, group learning, and self-regulatory learning. Learning approaches. Individuals from different cultures employ different approaches to learning. It starts at the very basic level of understanding. In traditional, non-agrarian, non-Western communities, children acquire new behaviors by observing and co-participating in everyday activities. On the other hand, verbally supported and goal-directed instruction through educational institutions are employed by children in Western industrialized environment. One of the recent research by Brown et al. In 2007 indicated that learners from USA use rote memory learning more than from students in Japan who are achieving learners. Rote memory learning refers to a type of learning in which motivation is to repeat what is learned without focusing on understanding. Achieving learning intends to focus on obtaining an acceptable grade towards which efforts and study time are directed. There is another kind of learning called deep learning, in which the emphasis is on valuing the subject, understanding the material, and relating ideas to one another. This has been illustrated by Biggs. According to Burden, locus of control and attributions of success influence learning as well. Students with external locus of control tend to emphasize on rote memory learning and low level of assertiveness. Internal locus of control is attributed consequence of learning to own behavior and exhibit a tendency towards deep learning. Such differences are also observed between Sanskrit schools and Western school educations. Since pupils tend to organize their work based on importance, it was seen that students in Western culture gave more importance to objects, whereas those of Sanskritic schools gave more importance to events. Cognitive development is also impacted by the reward-punishment system. Students in Asian countries, punishment is in the form of ridicule and shaming, whereas praise is reserved for exceptional performance. Therefore, reward serves as a motivation for learning. No such patterns are observed in the Western countries. Group learning. Group learning is both a process as well as outcome in which acquisition of knowledge, skills, etc. lead to changes in behaviors and group performance. This is influenced by certain conditions such as whether stimuli are noticed, openness to new experiences, and adaptability to evolving norms, and ability, flexibility, and willingness to learn from other cultures. Another concept closely related to this is cultural intelligence, that is, the ability of a group to understand and communicate with people from other countries and cultures. There are three aspects of this. First, the capacity to rethink and change the preconceived notions about self as well as others. Second, there should be motivation to adapt one's behavior. And third, produce correct cultural responses. Since teams and not individuals are the fundamental learning units of modern organizations, it is important to note cultural differences in team learning. According to Popper, there are two forms of team learning. Learning in organizations, that is LIO, where members learn on behalf of the organization, or learning by organization, that is LBO, when individual level learning has an organizational impact. In addition, there are also shared organizational learning values. These include transparency, inquiry, integrity, issue orientation, and accountability. These are supplemented by psychological states of safety and commitment. Differences in cultures of different organizations are systematically classified under 4 dimensions by Hofstede. Power distance. It is a measure of interpersonal influence between a boss and a subordinate as perceived by the subordinate. This leads to tolerance of authority-based relationships. Second, the uncertainty avoidance. It is a measure of the degree to which people avoid unpredictable, unclear situations. This leads to stricter codes of conduct being developed to reduce risks. Third, individualism, collectivism. It describes the relationship between individual and group in social settings. In individualistic cultures, the emphasis is on individual interests, whereas in collectivistic societies, interdependencies are highly valued. Fourth, masculinity. It is a measure of degree of differentiation of roles on a culture. In masculine cultures, work is central to people's lives and material success is a socially legitimate ambition. In feminine cultures, the focus is on quality of life and personal relationships. Self-regulatory learning. A social learning perspective on self-regulated learning, according to Zimmerman, perceives the students to be self-regulated learners to the extent that they are metacognitively, motivationally, and behaviorally active participants in their own learning processes. Holloway states that there is evidence suggesting that the primary cause for academic success in Japan is prevalence of endeavor over aptitude. Intelligence as an ability is rated less as compared to efforts. Students are assumed to be all equal, with differences in academic achievements being correlated to efforts expended. Corollary, a study of cultural differences in self-regulatory learning by Purdy and Haiti shows that Japanese students were much more likely to use learning strategies than the Australian students. The self-regulated strategies taken into consideration in this study were self-evaluation, organization and transformation, goal setting and planning, information seeking, record keeping, and self-monitoring, environmental structuring, giving self-consequences, rehearsing and memorizing, seeking social assistance from peers, teachers or other adults, and reviewing. These factors are thought to represent the range of behaviors that students engage in to regulate their personal functioning, academic behavioral performance, learning environments. Hence, it is seen that cultural factors that have huge role to play in understanding the mechanisms of learning. Finally, the next section will discover cultural insights in memory as a cognitive psychology. Memory. Trends in the mainstream psychology of memory. Traditionally, memory had been defined as the mental capacity to encode, store, and retrieve information. In general terms, it was understood as a mental faculty that enables us to draw on our past experiences in order to use it in our present. Tracing past research on memory, mainstream psychologists had focused on the stimulus-response pairing of the information. Later, the focus has shifted from simple SR pairing to the mode of processing utilized by the learner and operation employed by the learner in processing of information. In fact, there had been general agreement on the structures or the systems of memory, that are long-term memory, short-term memory, and sensory memory. These systems are known to be a storehouse that keeps information for a specific period of time. Recently, psychologists have questioned the absolutist stance taken by mainstream psychologists. Henceforth, few questions that had been put forward in discourse are: is there cultural variations in how people remember things? Does culture impact the classification schemes of the memory system? And can we observe variations in the way a particular group, subgroup of people form a particular context can retain things? These questions instill us to scrutinize issues like what aspects are universal in the process of memory, to what extent can we say is the memory a relative process? With these two questions in mind, we will uncover the process of memory from the cross-cultural perspectives. Factors impacting memory. Remembering is a dynamic and multifaceted process which may be impacted by subtle or dramatic changes. One of the major challenges faced while studying memory are the multitude of complex factors which influence it. Some of these include: the first are the hormonal or the neuromodulatory. A very large body of evidence from animal studies indicate that adrenergic stress hormones released peripherally during emotionally arousing events modulate the storage of memory for the events. The next category is the genetic and pharmacological. There are a large number of studies suggesting that pharmacological drugs, that is the dopamine agents, can enhance working memory. There is also consistent evidence that cholinesterase inhibitors can enhance working memory function. Developmental and age-related influences. Many older adults have reported increased memory failures with increased age. While older adults may be limited in the information they are able to process due to deterioration of the sensory modalities, the information that enters the sensory store is just as accessible for older adults as it is for the younger adults and decays at essentially the same rate. Arousal, emotion and personality. Emotion leads to enhanced memory, and evidence is presented that people process, encode and retrieve information differently depending upon whether they are feeling happy, fearful, angry or sad. Unconscious, schematic or semantic influences. Information that is congruent with existing knowledge, that is a schema, is usually better remembered than less congruent information. Moreover, incongruent, that is the novel information, is also sometimes better remembered. In addition, there are also cultural influences. It is these cultural influences on memory that we will focus on the following segments of the chapter. Cross-cultural variations in conception of memory. Memory has been defined differently in different cultures. For example, in an aboriginal language, East Cree of North America, the term used for memory is Mitunichikan, which integrates mental processes ranging from thinking to feelings along with social practices. Every culture represented by its practices and conventional forms influences our time, self-concept, as well as our perception of the world. These definitions of memory focus on conceptualizing memory not as a static, immutable brain process, but culmination of socio-cultural factors. In order to protect their culture, the group members need to remember their value systems, history, rituals, etc. Hence, the relation between memory and culture may be considered bidirectional. Memory is impacted by our perception of our own culture as well as perception of others. That is, when people perceive their own culture, they encode, store and retrieve information differently than when they perceive outgroups. Under such circumstances, knowledge about culture, valence about outgroups, expectancy consistency, mood congruency, etc. are some of the factors influencing memory. In the next segment, we will discuss the cultural influences on memory. Cross-cultural influences on memory. Since memory as such is a vast topic with many of its features still undergoing the process of research, we will focus on 4 prominent principles of memory which reflect a prominent cultural influence. They are autobiographical memory, story memory, numerical processing and free recall. Autobiographical memory. It is important to note that cultural influences take place at 2 levels. The first is the individual level, at cognitive schemata and personal strategies related to memory. And the second is the social level, that is, at mnemonic practices and exchange. For example, an American focuses on object within a scene because of an organizational environment, whereas Japanese focuses on the background and relations between objects due to their complex interwoven environment. Thus, it becomes imperative to note that self-concept of an individual also reflects cultural differences. Western scholars note a distinct autonomous note in the autobiographical memories of their subjects, while the Eastern counterparts note a relational emphasis. The content of autobiographical memories shows contrasting evidence. While the people of European descent focus on personal experiences and emotions, those of Asian descent focus on interpersonal relations and group activities. Also, autobiographical memories provide a framework for young children upon which their emotional and behavioral guidance is based. European American preschool children tend to give detailed accounts of personal emotions, whereas East Asian preschool children focus on significant others during reminiscence. Culture also defines how people visualize their personal memories. European North Americans tend to envision a social setting from their own perspective, and that is how they remember such situations, whereas Asian North Americans visualize from other perspectives. Story memory. Language comprehension is culturally defined. People depend on their knowledge to construct their intended meanings. Knowledge is composed of scripts which are culturally dependent. This is reflected in everyday activities as well as stories. Research undertaken in this context indicates that stories consistent with an individual's culture knowledge are remembered accurately and for a longer duration. Also, culture may have a distorting effect on those memories which are inconsistent with the beliefs held by the individuals. Numerical processing. The influence of cultural factors on mental representation of numbers helps us in understanding the multifaceted relation existing between culture and human cognition. The concept of mental number line, that is MLN, is the basis for understanding the arithmetic computation. This cultural impact on processing and storage of numerals is reflected in the fact that different structures of the brain are responsible for processing MNL. Free recall. Free recall refers to the ease of recollection of an event, etc. A recent study indicates that Western school-educated people, example Americans, are much likely to cluster the words together to ease their recollection compared to their Eastern, example in China, counterparts. This phenomenon is especially observed in case of elderly adults in Eastern societies because of less exposure to Western style education. Such phenomenon can be explained due to differential exposure to stimuli as a result of cultural settings. Memory learning linkage. Memory structures can be understood in terms of memory contents that arise from learning. Information processing models of memory and learning indicate that memory structures are a result of symbol and symbol manipulations, associations, and plans. Theorists have proposed 4 kinds of organized memory structures. They are the networks of propositions, intellectual skills, images, and episodes. Networks of propositions. Prominent theorists such as Anderson's, Bauer, etc. considered memory to be made up of symbols serving the purpose of concepts and symbol structures serving as concept relations. Basic element of information is represented as verbs. Cluster of information is known as the nodes. Intellectual skills. Rumelhart et al. Proposed that the events stored on memory can be modified by experience due to changes in relations, concepts, propositions, and operators. Thus, intellectual skills can be defined as structures which underline identification of concepts and application of rule. Image. Pavio proposed a dual process of memory wherein the information can be encoded and stored as linguistic character as well as images. Imagery involves 3 levels of processing. They are representational, referential, and associative. Episodic. Episodic memory, as conceived by Tunving, structures storing temporally and temporal spatial relations amongst the events. All these memory structures influence how we learn. Summary. Cognition is defined as the process of knowing, including attending, remembering, and reasoning. Also, the content of the processes such as concepts and memories. Memory is defined as the mental capacity to encode, store, and retrieve information. There are numerous factors impacting memory. Culture is one such important factor influencing memory. Research has clearly shown influences of culture on autobiographical memory, story memory, numerical processing, and free recall. Memory structures are an important means of understanding the association existing between the memory and learning. Learning can be defined as the process based on experience which results in a relatively permanent change in behavior or behavior potential. Research indicates that cultural factors are influential in the learning process. Bourdieu, Claude Steele, and Lev Vygotsky are the prominent social scientists who have worked in this field. Cultural differences are observed in the basic beliefs about learning. For example, Western ideals are Socratic in nature, whereas Eastern ideals, like Chinese, are Confucian in nature. Research has clearly shown influences of culture on learning approaches, group learning, and self-regulated learning.